Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our webinar series, which are growing in popularity, and also we're going to be going to one a week, which is really exciting for the new year because we've had so much interest. So that's really great news. I'm Lucy Brown. I'm the Director of Nursing and Deputy Director of the Florence Nightingale Academy, and it gives me great pleasure to host this morning's webinar with Major Mike Collins. Now, Mike is actually one of our current scholars, one of our emerging leader scholars, so it's wonderful that you've taken the opportunity to share your expertise with us today. Mike is also an experienced emergency nursing officer and has been in active service in Iraq, Afghanistan and Canada, to name a few. He's really patient focused and currently has responsibility in governance and quality assurance, something that I'm really an advocate for as well. Mike's studied a master's in occupational psychology and is currently in his third year of his PhD in nursing, which is focusing on professional identity, which is the topic this morning of the webinar. So we're really interested to hearing about your studies in that, Mike, today. We will be recording, so we are recording this webinar. So if you have any issues with that, please let us know and we can discuss it kind of outside of this remit. We will be having a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions for Mike, jot them down. If you're not comfortable to say them out loud, please pop them in the chat and I can ask them on your behalf. And obviously if you've got any comments for Mike as well, pop them in the chat too. We really want this to stimulate kind of discussion and debate, and Mike's really happy to share his contact details with you if you wanted to kind of discuss any element further as well. So we'll share those with you at the end of today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand across to Mike, who's going to share his presentation this morning. Really excited to be hearing from you, Mike, so welcome. But just quickly, before I do hand across, one more thing to add, Mike, I hope you don't mind. Mike, quite incredibly, with his emerging leader group and some other military colleagues, will be riding Le Jog, which is Land's End to John O'Groats, which he'll be doing in April next year. I'm hoping to join him for a couple of legs in the southwest, because that's where I'm based. But Mike is doing it with his fellow scholars. It's quite incredible actually to sponsor a future scholar. So their aim is to raise enough to, yeah, it's great paper, isn't it? Absolutely fantastic. So I'll hand across to Mike so he can share some details, but we'll be sharing it. Look out for the comms and please do share it far and wide. It's an amazing thing to do, Mike. Thank you. So without further ado, across to you.
Lucy, thank you, and thank you for that incredible introduction. It's very rare that you turn around in front of a group of people and actually go, how do I follow the introduction? So thank you. Well, to be fair, it's my honour and my privilege to be able to talk to you today, and as much as anything, because what we're going to discuss within the realm of professional identity looks across nursing and spans an impact that could actually affect every single one of our patients, that every single one of the 700,000 and odd thousand nurses registered with the Nursing and Midwifery Council may actually see. So why me? And I think that's a reasonable question. Who am I? So as I say, Lucy's just given me a tremendous introduction. But actually, where we look at identity, we must go back to our roots. And we had a really interesting conversation before other people came online about our roots and where we came from. And actually, because that's important to what we do. How does somebody like me end up coming from a little town in the Lake District, from a primary school of 23 children, to be sat here talking to you today? Because that is my identity. And essentially what happened, so I started student nurse training in 2002, and my story is going to be the thread that runs through this, because I turned around to one of our lecturers back when I was a first year student, and I asked them the question, when we take a blood pressure, when we take a blood glucose reading why don't we wash the finger with alcohol wipes? And we know the answer now, and that's well founded within the evidence. But actually the response that came back from the lecturer at the time was, but Mike, you don't need to know that, you're just going to be a nurse. And something about that resonated with me. There was something about that that hit quite hard, and I didn't particularly like. And so if we wind forward, and that played on my mind through my deployments in Iraq, through my deployments in Afghanistan, where I used to serve forward. So when I was younger, fitter, and an awful lot more supple in my joints than I am now, I used to work forward at what we call Role 1 with either the cavalry or with the Royal Marines. And so that's a very different identity to working in a hospital. And something about that felt different, but I didn't know what. When we wind forward again, I got to 2014 and I commissioned. So I'd got to sergeant and I commissioned forward to be a captain. And I struggled. I really struggled in my first 2 years as an officer, to the point, and the picture there of the Buddha is actually quite reasonable, because actually in 2015, I sat there as a training officer. I was a band 7 in civilian terms, and I was responsible for the military training within our unit of a couple of hundred people. One Friday afternoon, I had a nervous breakdown. My world fell apart. I phoned my CEO and went, "Thanks very much, sir, you've broken me," which is probably not the thing to do, and nor would I advocate anybody ever doing that again. But I did. I had a nervous breakdown, and it took me a long time to come back from that. But a part of that was doing my master's degree. I wanted to know, as all good academics do, why did this happen to me? What does the evidence say? And how do I stop this happening to others? Because what I didn't know at the time is when I went from sergeant to when I went to captain, my identity had changed. But what we didn't have in place was an understanding of how we form that identity, nor did we have in place an understanding of how to support people to form that identity. And that's what drives the presentation that you're going to see today. So as part of my master's degree, and I'm an A&E nurse, and A&E nurses were like pilots. How do you know you're talking to an A&E nurse? Probably because we'll tell you. And that comes from pride in what we do. That comes from a really positive sense of our professional identity. But actually, it was relevant in what I did. So I undertook a constructivist ethnographic study. And the reason I took social constructivism was because where we look at identity, identity appertains to us as individuals. Therefore, at no point can we suggest that there's one universal version of the truth. Because what identity means to me, what it might mean to Robin, as somebody I've worked with for many years, what it might mean to Lucy, or what it might mean to Alex that I've seen is also online, is completely different. And there's really good reasons for that. And I'll explain some of those about identity formation later. But actually looking at it from an A&E perspective, that allowed me to acknowledge my own reflexivity, because I can empathize with what it means to be an A&E nurse, because I am one. And regardless of the fact I work in governance and assurance now, and I generally sit here for a good number of hours in my week, if people ask me what I do, I'm still an A&E nurse, and that will never change, and nor should it ever. So I undertook a series of interviews across registered nurses from band 5 to 7, because of course at band 5 to 7, they are the cohort of nurses that are still patient facing. The reality is once we hit 8A and above, we lose much of that patient facing mentality. But actually, arguably what we do on a daily basis still has an impact on patient care, but how we do that is just different. And I looked at how do perceptions, because it was a qualitative study, it was an ethnographic study, so we were perception based, and we looked at perceptions surrounding identity formation. We triangulated the interview outcomes with the research, with some conversations that I'd had in research. Basically, for the 12 months that preceded the release of my dissertation, every conversation I had surrounded identity, and I did have a degree of sympathy for anybody who came near me and started discussing the subject. But actually, we then looked at the current research, and that was kind of the background to this, and this is what catalyzed an awful lot of the conversations I've had in the last 18 months or so. So in reality, what is professional identity? By definition, it's the attitudes, the values, the knowledge, the beliefs and skills that are shared with others in a professional group. Fundamentally, it's what provides us the meaning to be a part of a professional group. It's what gives us the meaning that when I say I'm a nurse, that means something to me, as I guess that it will mean something to every single person sat on this call, where they sit within their group as a nurse or even within another profession. And interestingly, what we're starting to see from the research that I'm now doing downstream is that there's a number of areas of transferability and generalizability from the master's research, looking at a really small cohort of emergency nurses more outwardly into the nursing population. And actually, with some conversations I've had this week and last week, into particularly some of our GP colleagues, mindful of what's going on with GPs in the media at this moment in time. So why do I mention my past? Because it creates our foundations. And if I present this face to face, I actually play a song at this point in time. And you'll all be familiar with the song from The Greatest Showman, This Is Me. Because for many of us, we are brave, we are bruised, and this is me. It's what creates who we are. Because as nurses, and I'll go on to this in a moment, but nurses, when anybody asks us what we do, the first thing, we don't say we're a father, we're a mother, we're a husband, we're a wife. The first thing many of us will say is we're a nurse. So from a foundation, we have to look at where our foundations sit within identity. Is our identity one of makeup? Do we put that makeup on our face metaphorically in the morning to cover up the bruising, to cover up the scars, and to cover up those battle wounds, to allow people to see the identity that we want them to see? And sometimes I think strategically within nursing, we do that, particularly when we look at the last 18 months, because we have to acknowledge that from an identity perspective, the last 18 months has been hard. And that doesn't matter whether or not you're sat in an office or whether you're sat at the coalface, because it has still been hard, but it's been hard in a different way for everybody because everybody is different. Equally, actually, are your foundations built on bedrock? Are your foundations built of concrete? Have we got that reinforced iron bar through the foundations? And actually, have we managed to support that identity formation appropriately to enable the foundations to be formed in that way? Because this should be our utopia, but we're human beings. We're built of flesh and bone, right? We cut us and we bleed. But actually, where we can get to this is our utopia. But equally, we also have to accept from an identity perspective, many of us will have foundations that are built on sand because it looks nice. It looks functional. It does what we need it to do. But as soon as that tide comes in, it's going to get washed away. And actually, where we consider identity and some of the stages that I'll talk about later, we need to consider the foundations of our colleagues, particularly as leaders, to be able to understand how we can support that identity formation. Because our foundations and where that sits will, of course, impact that. As I say, identity is different, we suspect, for nurses compared to other professions. And this is really interesting when you look at the discourse at the moment surrounding things like Protect Nurse. And I will give a massive shout out at this point to Alison Leary and the work she's doing on Protect Nurse, because it is just phenomenal. And I'm a firm believer that we absolutely need to protect our title. Because as nurses, very often, if somebody asks us who we are, we will say we're a nurse. Nurses, through personality, and we'll talk about personality in a moment, it allows our personality very often is what draws us in, not just to nursing, but through something called social theory or social learning theory. It draws us into the area of nursing that we go into. And I'll have a little bit of a play with A&E nurses and ITU nurses in a bit, because let's be fair, there is nothing better as an A&E nurse than sending the photo around your ITU nurse colleagues every year of the clustered tree lights and going, Happy Christmas. But that is an identity consideration. But as humans, we have multiple identities and we have to acknowledge that. And our professional identity is only one of these. More importantly, our perception of our professional identity is shown to link with the quality of care, patient experience, and patient outcome. Where nurses have a positive sense of their professional identity, it's shown to correlate with better patient care, better patient experience, and better patient outcomes. And let's be fair, patient outcome is what we're about. Where a nurse is prepared to stand there and say, I'm proud to be a nurse, I feel empowered, I feel able to question that bad decision, to be able to turn around to that colleague who's asked us to give 1,000 units of insulin and say, actually, that's wrong. And to be able to do that in a position of psychological safety is always going to allow us to advocate better for our patients and have that better outcome. But equally within the research, negative identities or alien identities are also cited. So a negative identity is that, or a negative perception of identity more accurately, is that person that turns around and goes, I'm just a nurse, I don't matter, I've got nothing to say. I've been told for many years that I'm inconsequential. So actually, what's the point of speaking up? Because I'm not valued. More interestingly is the alien identity, though. These are nurses and other professions, in fairness, who align their identity with that of another professional group. And I'll use A&E nurses as an example here. Normally with males in A&E, but it's the number of A&E nurse practitioners and majors nurse practitioners who try and pretend that they're baby doctors. They're aligning an identity with that of a doctor. There's something really positive about being a nurse. And actually, as a nurse in a nurse practitioner role, we add something different. But we do see within the research that some people will try and align with the doctor's identity, or with that of a healthcare assistant. I can't give drugs. Nobody gives drugs in this area. That's not for me to do. Right? Actually, what's the difference between my role and that of a HCA? Actually, what's the difference between my role and that of a receptionist? Because in reality, this comes through our identity formation. And it's not the end product, and what we're seeing isn't the issue. It's the causation that allows us to get there. And that's why we need to look at identity formation. But equally, and particularly during COVID, and the reason I mention about the last 18 months is that the research is starting to show us that professional identity may have a protective mechanism from a well-being perspective. We took many nurses from medical wards and put them into ITU. But actually, and where I mentioned about the personality piece, and I'll mention that here, there's a number of ways we can measure personality, and the 5-factor model works really nicely. Because many emergency nurses, and I'm slightly different here, they will be extroverts. They take their energy from being in the presence of others. When it comes to an agreeableness, I don't think we've ever met many emergency nurses who are overly agreeable. We have really low levels of neuroticism. We're not those people that are going to be sat there worrying about whether our patient's got a mean arterial pressure of 70 or 75. What we care about is they have a mean arterial pressure. When we look at it, they're highly conscientious. Okay. And in essence, we don't mind change because our day is about change. We sit in our resource department and we'll roll that resource department 3 or 4 times in a day. And we don't know what's coming through the door. Where we look at our ITU nurse colleagues, and I can comment on this only because it's where I've looked into, most ITU nurses in many cases will be introverts. They take their energy from being in the presence of themselves. They're generally highly agreeable. They're much happier to have those open conversations and to take suggestions from outside because they work in a more arguably of an MDT sense than we do within A&E. Within A&E, we have ourselves, we have our doctors, we have our team, and that is us. They have really high levels of neuroticism because they have to do their jobs. They care whether that mean arterial pressure is 70 or 75. And they get really excited when the patient, of course, has been to the toilet in the lift on the way upstairs as well. They don't like change. But like in A&E, they're highly conscientious. So where we look at that as an example, where personality is shown to impact identity, even within A&E and ITU, we will fundamentally have 2 different professional identities because our personalities are inextricably different. From a well-being perspective, therefore, if we take a nurse from a medical ward where their personality may be different to ITU, we put them onto ITU and we ask them to change their professional identity. How often do we hear medical wards or medical nurses being told they're generalists with the inability to accept a medical nurse as being a specialist in their own right? I can't nurse on a medical ward, as I found out a few years ago, because it's that long ago since I nursed on a ward. I struggle with that. And we have to have the humility to recognize that medical ward nurses, they are specialists. And so we take a specialist from one area, we move them to another. We ask them to change their identity. We fail to recognize that their personality is going to be different, arguably to that of the area they've been to. They've helped deal with COVID, and to be fair, they've done a tremendous job. What we then do is we then return them back to their clinical area. We ask them to change their identities again, but we put all of the wellbeing support into ITU because the wellbeing support goes to those whose identity is that of an ITU nurse. professional identity has a huge protective mechanism from a well-being perspective and can never be more important, I would argue, than it is now. And there's a few other considerations within this. So nursing is changing. Arguably in 2013 was the point at which nursing fulfilled the criteria to be a profession. That was when nurses had to be degree educated. And where we look at what defines profession as a well-developed body of knowledge based on scientific proof and research with a focused system of education programs, arguably that can mean degree level education. So we've got a group of nurses coming through the training system at the moment who are looking at nursing from an academic perspective. They're looking at it from a degree level perspective. They're looking at it in a very different way to nurses were pre-2013. If we go back further, and whilst I look like I probably read the journal article at the time, but I can assure you I didn't, in 1943 in the nursing standard, to give an intramuscular injection was a doctor-only task. Where we look at nursing associates now, nursing associates are giving intramuscular injections. Where we look at when I first qualified in 2006, to give that first dose of IV antibiotics was a doctor-only task, even though the patient would have the anaphylactic reaction on the second dose. And whereas now we're prescribing the antibiotics and we're doing that with aplomb. And there's significant viewpoints, discordant viewpoints between the profession and whether it should be vocation or a profession, and where education plays that. And that's something from an identity perspective we're going to need to look at as we move forward. Equally, and as I probably alluded to over the last 22 minutes or so, then the two things that really support identity formation are a supportive hierarchy, and I'll explain that on the next couple of slides, and mentorship. Mentorship is key to identity formation. If we have mentorship in place, identity formation is quite a long way downstream. And I've mentioned personality, but this is where, as nurses, because our personality supports our identity formation, and not just as nurses, but within our specialist areas, then I would argue this is some of where when people ask us who we are or what do, we will answer with we're a nurse, because our professional identity and our personality are inextricably linked. So what's the theory behind this? And psychologists, there's a joke on the slide. I particularly like the Pavlov piece. But we look at nurses. Nurses in many cases are really visual. I certainly am. I have a visual element. I have a significant kinesthetic element. And so Bandura's theory on social learning theory, that applies, because nurses learn the rules of the game from watching other nurses. If we as nurses are saying that, actually, I'm just a nurse, that junior nurse will learn that actually that subservient approach works. Well, it doesn't. It just worked in that instance, and that will impact their identity formation. Equally, from a social identity perspective, we need to look at the concept of social structures. We need to look at the concept of hierarchy, because, and particularly with our international nursing, I'll talk about identity shift in a moment, the social structure surrounding nursing will impact our professional identity. Who we are and how we associate with our colleagues, both within the nursing team and out with into our other professional groups, our doctor colleagues, our physio colleagues, our OT colleagues, etc., will impact on our social identity. If we look at what's happening within the media at the moment, and where people are talking, how they feel that, like, as a media, they can talk about who we are as nurses and what we should be doing, that is because of the social identity that is created within the public discourse. And as nurses, and I would encourage every one of you, where able, to start to challenge that. There is nothing to stop us challenging this discourse at a senior level and actually starting to change the language. Because as nurses, we are professionals. We do stand proud to look after our patients, and who we are is what we do. But more importantly is social cognitive theory. So essentially, social cognitive theory learns about outcomes, they learn about consequence. They learn that if that band 7, and it's interesting how we always refer to ourselves by our agenda for change banding, not the role that we do. But if that band 7 or that ward sister or that charge nurse or etc. responds to somebody or does something, they receive a rebuttal for that. then those nurses who are coming through and forming their identities, actually, they will learn not to do that, because that is the consequence that comes from that, interestingly, is negative. But actually, where we look within the multidisciplinary team and we look to raise each other up, and actually I'll often look at the Westlife song, "You Raise Me Up," right? We need to raise each other up. We need to stand on mountains. We need to show who we are and just how much being a nurse adds to what we do. Because through social cognitive theory, if people are watching us and they learn to understand consequence by our actions, well, actually, it just shows the power that we as nurses have in taking forward the direction of our profession in the way Florence did with her notes on nursing back in the 1850s. So what contributes to professional identity formation? What did I find? Well, this is the table that underpins a lot of what I've just said over the last 25 minutes or so. There's 5 areas of effects. So there's the group. We have to acknowledge the social side of it. We have to acknowledge our social identity. Where do we sit within that group? And where do we sit hierarchically within that group? Because departmentally, I would argue, we're like most families. Within A&E, we can take the mickey out of each other and have a go at each other. But God forbid if another department comes and starts having a pop at A&E. Because socially within that environment, and the same applies within the other areas, I would argue as well, that we sit as a group, we sit as a really strong cohort, and that starts to drive who we are. We'd look at humor, and humor is a massive part of what drives our social identity. And that's where personality comes into it very often, because actually, if we look at the humor we share within A&E, I would argue it's very similar. But there's jokes that I will crack in A&E that if I were to make the same joke within a community setting, wouldn't be understood, because implicitly the language we are using appertains to where we are. That essentially comes down to empathy. We have to discuss the role effects, as we say. Nursing is changing, but our values should not. There's a piece within the Code of Conduct, of course, that talks about the fact that we should treat our patients with both dignity and respect, and quite rightly so too. So just because the profession is changing its identity, and within professions, we have to consider something called higher order identities and lower order identities. The lower order identity is that identity that we are expected to hold within our clinical areas, or possibly even within our trusts, or within the community setting, or within our CCG. The higher order identity is that identity that's set for us by our regulatory bodies. It's impacted by some of the social issues that we've seen, maybe within unions or within other professional groups over the course of the year, and how that's portrayed in the media. It's impacted by the public and the perception of the public as to what a nurse does. Why is it that I can walk into a patient's bay and go, "Hi, I'm Mike, I'm the nurse looking after you today"? The female doctor then walks in 5 minutes later and goes, "That's okay, nurse, I've seen the doctor already." Equally, the impact of the pressure of a role, no more so at the moment, will impact identity. Where we look at people that are here now, how many people didn't or came close to not logging on this morning because they were worried about actually how much work they'd got to do, and were patients going to suffer by them logging on to listen to this for an hour? Our managers are huge in this though, and manager support is key to identity formation. Manager support is key to mentorship, and it's key to setting the culture. I've explained about the effect of others, but equally, there's that piece ourselves and that piece for us as a person. Where do we come from? Who are we? And how did we get to where we are? Why is my story relevant to my identity? Because actually, that will impact our confidence. That will impact our nascent ability to stand there and go, "I'm a nurse. I'm really proud to be a nurse. I'm here, and I'm happy to challenge what you've just said, if in the right way and as is appropriate." But equally, we need to look at a transitioning ID as well, or a transitioning identity as well. How many people get to 8A as a grade and suddenly go, "Yeah, I don't see patients anymore. I'm not patient facing," almost in a devaluing sense of their identity. Our identity will transition throughout our careers, and that is normal. and should be acknowledged and encouraged. Because regardless of what we're doing, we're still impacting patient care. Just because we're not putting that cannula in that patient or giving that patient those drugs, we're still impacting patient care. And our identity will change over the course of our careers, and that is normal. Because there's 4 stages that we found, but actually there's only 3 of those that we can really impact as from a nursing perspective, but we need to be aware of all 4. So our formative years and our pre-nurse training will impact our professional identity. I've explained how personality impacts identity, but actually our personality forms up until we're around about 21. So there's an interesting crossover between stage 1 and stage 2, because for many student nurses who are going through the educational spectrum, they are still learning who they are as people. At the same time, they're trying to learn who they are as student nurses. And for many people, it's in our formative years where we establish our motivation for becoming a nurse. But we also need to acknowledge that for some people, it won't be. I didn't plan to be a nurse until I started nurse training. And interestingly, what we're starting to see is in the post-2013 era, that cohort is growing. Student nurse training then has a huge impact. And it's not, of course, just those nurses that sit within a purely educational sense. Well, actually, those of us that provide a mentorship piece, and I keep coming back to mentorship, we have the ability to support that professional identity formation in student nurses as they move through their placements. There's a good reason why student nurses will often struggle in their second year, because they're going from the unconscious incompetence, so wrong. They're going from the conscious incompetence to the unconscious competence stage. But actually, that will have an identity effect. That needs mentorship to help us move through that. Equally, what we're starting to do is to teach student nurses the rules. They're learning from watching us. They're learning through social learning theory. Once nurses move into the qualified stage, they learn who they are as a nurse. And this is where we start to see some of the challenges with nurses going straight into what we would regard as specialist areas on qualification. Now, I'm never going to say that that's a bad idea, but we need to be really aware and really emotionally aware as nurses within the profession that when student nurses come to A&E, ITU, the community, or any other specialist area on qualification, they are learning who they are as nurses. They are not learning who they are as specialist nurses. We need to have the emotional intelligence as nurses to be aware of that and support that. Because if we ask a student, a newly qualified nurse, to come into A&E, for example, and to learn who they are as an A&E nurse without learning who they are as a nurse first, then potentially they will struggle. What then happens is as they move through into the sister or the charge nurse roles, they actually start to develop the knowledge required in that specialist area. And at that senior staff nurse, the old E grade level, that's where this very often seems to happen, because they're mirroring and role modeling other nurses in that area, but also other nurses are starting to mirror and role model them. They're becoming leaders. So I talk about leaders and I talk about role modeling. I talk about mentorship because all of this relates to how we form our professional identity, who we are as a nurse and what it means to be a nurse in our area. And role modeling within mentorship is key. So Bandura, and there's a reference list at the end, this one's on there, that Bandura suggests 4 activities required for role modeling to take place. A learner needs to have observed what is being modeled. They need to create a mental observation of the behavior. They need to reproduce what was modeled whilst monitoring their own performance. And they need to become motivated to incorporate the behavior into their work. Doesn't that sound like a preceptorship program? Because actually within those preceptorship programs, for example, we need to give them the opportunity to observe that appropriate behavior. One of the standards of the British Army is the appropriate behavior. We expect our people to do it. We expect the same within nurses. Again, I refer you to the code. We need to give our learners the time and the support to reflect on what they've seen to create a mental model. But more importantly, they need a psychologically safe environment, and a just culture is required. Failure must be seen as part of the learning process. And fundamentally, moreover, in the nurses that we're starting to see come through the system now, they need to understand the why. They need to see authenticity. If we look at leadership from a generational perspective, technically, I'm just about a millennial. I will naturally try and lead in a transformational style. It's what I was taught was the done thing when I was going through school. We were taught to look up to significant leaders such as Henry VIII. We looked at what Hitler was doing. We looked at what Maggie Thatcher was doing and others. That will define our leadership, some of our natural leadership style as we grow up, as we move forward. If we go to the generation before me, we call them latchkey kids because they were the first generation who couldn't expect to have a parent at home when they came home from school. They had a key to the door and they took the key and took the door off the latch. They were the latchkey kids. So relationship is really important to them. How many senior nurses and senior leaders do we see where if you have a high quality relationship with them, it goes really well? If you have a low quality relationship with them, maybe less so. It's called leader-member exchange, and it's a natural form of leadership. But actually with our new generation, so 1994 to 2010, they're coming through the system and many of those are starting to hit senior roles. Some of those are now 27, which is really scary. But these people, they need authenticity. They've been brought up with social media. Who puts a photo on social media and doesn't put a filter across it to cover out the light or change some of the shadowing on their face? In that generation, it's really rare. Like, they will generally put filters. They don't have authenticity in their online lives. So what they want from us is authenticity. They want us to allow them to understand the why. That's why when I started this presentation, I outlined the why very often before I give the definition. And actually, and I'm happy for this presentation to be shared around, that why there links to the Simon Sinek TED Talk on Just Ask Why. And I think that's brilliant. There's also another really interesting Simon Sinek talk from a role modeling perspective, where he talks about the fact that good leaders eat last. In the military, as a senior officer, it is expected that my soldiers eat before me. If we're eating as a cohort, our soldiers and our senior NCOs and our junior officers, they eat first. And Simon Sinek's piece on that resonates really well. And I'd encourage you to look at both of those, but look at those based on from an identity perspective. But equally, we're seeing more so now something about cultural identity. And cultural identity sits within two levels. There's the identity of culture. There's that social piece with us as nurses or within our clinical areas. But also, we've got to look at it at an individual level. We have to look at why more Black, Asian, minority ethnic nurses or IEN colleagues are referred to fitness to practice compared to our non-Black, Asian, minority ethnic colleagues. But by proportion, the same number go to hearing. That's a really powerful statement. But actually, some of this comes down to cultural identity. I was sat in a car. I used to give a friend of mine a lift home for my master's degree, and she comes from Zimbabwe. And as a Black academic female, we were having a conversation one day in the car, and she gave me a look that I read as contempt. So I had that relationship with her to be able to challenge the statement. And I was like, what didn't you like about what I said? Looking at your body language there, looking at what you just said, there was something you didn't like. And she turned around and went, no, Mike, I was just showing interest. The facial expression that I had read as contempt culturally within their ethnicity is interest. So from that perspective, even at a body language perspective, when we've already explained that for some of our senior leaders, they come from a position of relationship and a high quality relationship being important, we can start to understand why this becomes an issue. Equally, if we look at nurses, and I've done some work in the Middle East, as Lucy very kindly explained at the start, and if we take nurses from the Middle East, and Yazdanik is a good reference on this, where in the Middle East, nurses are regarded as a working class, and it's regarded as a vocation, because the view held of nursing and predominantly of women is fundamentally different to that within the UK. We take nurses from the Middle East, we bring them to the UK. Overnight, we change their professional identity. We ask them to be middle-class professionals. But what we also sometimes fail to acknowledge is the hierarchical nature of gender. Because many of our doctors who are male come from the same part of the world. So is there any wonder why when a doctor who shares their ethnicity, and this is one example, there are many others, but a doctor that shares their ethnicity tells them to do something, they're not going to challenge that unless we enforce a just culture and failure is seen as part of the learning process. What's really interesting is that when these nurses then go back to their home countries, and I call them their home countries, actually they revert back to the identity that they had, because their identity is formed throughout their childhood and as they're growing up. So where we blend those two areas together, and we look at this from the perspective of identity shift theory, we really need to be supporting some of our nurses that come from Black, Asian and minority ethnic and IEN communities, arguably more so than we do now. It is an identity issue. And fundamentally, it's not their issue, it's ours. It's for us to provide that mentorship. It's for us to have that empathy. It's for us to be able to provide that support. I quite like, there's an analogy I use fairly regularly, the footsteps in the sand story. And I'm not particularly religious, but I think it works in this instance, that where we take a nurse and where we take Paul was walking along the beach of Damascus, he looked up and he saw a light. The Lord looked down at him and said, Paul, what are you doing? He's like, I'm going to Damascus. Paul goes, but why do you care? You're never with me. Okay. And the Lord says, well, I am. Well, if you look when I walk alongside you. And Paul says, well, you do walk alongside me. When times are good, there's two sets of footsteps. When times are bad, there's one. Lord, when times are bad, you go away, you leave me alone. The Lord turns around to Paul and says, no, Paul, when times are good, I was walking alongside you. When times were bad, I was carrying you. Our role as leaders during identity change is to ensure that we carry our colleagues where needed. Never should we judge a person till we walk a mile in their shoes. But equally, if we need to pick them up and carry them with us, that will support their identity formation, particularly in the early stages of identity change. We've considered some of the wellbeing areas, and I did that earlier on because it flows into that part of the presentation quite nicely. But I am going to cover this because I would argue that from an identity perspective, nursing as a profession suffers with imposter syndrome. I'm not looking at this at an individual level here. I'm looking at this as a systems issue. But actually, something we need to look at, and there's two issues with imposter syndrome. So we will often turn around with imposter syndrome and say that more women experience imposter syndrome than men. Well, we would, because when the empirical research surrounding imposter syndrome was done, the purposeful sampling method took only Black women. So of course, when women are the entire sample of the first study, of course, we're going to turn around and say that women suffer it more than men. I would argue that imposter syndrome actually is more commonly personality based. And being that we've explained that personality is what drives our professional identity within nursing, there's little wonder why the two are linked. How often have we sat there, and this was my utopia, was the top left, was when we walk into that room and go, actually, all these people seem to have it together, and I've still got no clue what's happening. What we don't realize is that generally people with imposter syndrome, we will over-prepare and we don't blag it. So we feel like that, but we're probably the one person in the room that's well prepared. We're probably the one person in the room that when you ask them to explain what that acronym means, actually knows what that acronym means. But we're too scared to challenge it when somebody goes, there's this TLA, and we ask them what a TLA is. Right? For those that aren't aware, it's a 3-letter abbreviation. Equally, we'll take this view as to why did a good thing happen? Well, it's not luck. It's not a mistake. It's not because something bad is about to happen. It's because of the hard work, the effort, the talent, and the capability that we as nurses have. And I like this one from Emma Watson. And by the way, I watched my first Harry Potter film at the weekend. So I had to watch it to understand actually who she was. But Emma Watson said that it's almost like the better I do, the more my feeling of inadequacy actually increases. And because I'm just going, any moment someone's going to find out I'm a total fraud and that I don't deserve any of what I achieved. Well, this is great, but the other thing we need to be focused on with imposter syndrome is the fact that, yes, while people do suffer with it, and it's absolutely a thing, we shouldn't be labeling people with imposter syndrome to hide system failings. To turn around to people and say that you have imposter syndrome is actually really dangerous, because we learn through social learning theory how to act and consequence as a result of watching those around us. If you give somebody a label, well, actually, there's a potential that people will start to act in that way because that's the expected way to act with that label. And actually, if somebody's feeling like this, is it that they have imposter syndrome, or is it that there's actually a failing within the system and there's a wider system issue that's causing them to feel like this? I just encourage you to think about that as you move beyond lunch and into the afternoon. So in conclusion, and I've gone a little bit longer than I expected to, so Lucy, my apologies. But professional identity formation is a holistic process that's influenced by multiple indiscrete effects, many of which we can't control, but we need to be aware of. It requires a culture to exist both within the clinical area and outward into society supportive of its formation. As nurses, we have little opportunity to influence public perception, which is believed to have been driven by contemporary culture and the media. One of the interesting points here, though, is that for every 10 things we do well, we need to do 10 things to counteract the one thing that's gone badly. The media will always remember the bad. So we need to shout as nurses about who we are and what we do well. The more we shout about who we are, the more we will change that public perception. Nursing's identity is changing, which creates difficulties in nurses establishing their professional identity. It needs all of us to have empathy and understand that we don't judge a person until we walk a mile in their shoes. There are 4 stages of identity formation, and these have to be considered during a nurse's career. But equally, omitting one stage can be detrimental to the formation of a positive perception of professional identity. If we look at children that come through the care system, they will often live out their teenage years in their 20s, because Freud would suggest they have to live out their teenage years. Arguably, nurses within professional identity formation will do the same. If we miss out that third phase where they learn who they are as nurses, well, actually, at some point, they may have to go back and revisit that. There's some acknowledgements that I have to make. So I have to acknowledge Colonel Sharon Findlay, and I don't know if she's on the meeting today. I know she was going to be, but got pulled away to a meeting, and Group Captain Di Lam. Colonel Sharon was the Defence Professor of Nursing, sorry, wrong, she was the Defence Nurse Advisor, and Group Captain Lam, the Defence Professor of Nursing, who essentially provided me the support to do this and have shouted my capabilities to bring the research to where we are now. Within the Florence Nightingale Foundation, we have to shout out to Greta and to Gemma. What the foundation does is phenomenal. What it does to give a platform to people to be able to have these conversations is just unsurpassed in anywhere I've ever seen in my 20-year career. I need to mention my chain of command who give me the time to come and do this. And Brigadier Wilson's our medical director, and Colonel Ty was the head of the innovation department, which is where I do a little bit of work at the moment, has been my direct line manager for a year or so now. And to Portsmouth University, which is where the research is based out of. But most importantly, to my dog Alfie. All right, he is literally sat there copying me. He's a dog undertaking social learning theory. He's copying how I sit whilst watching TV. There are some references there if people want to go and read slightly further on this. But for the last 10 or 15 minutes, I'd just like to open up to questions. Lucy.
Thanks, Mike. God, what an incredible presentation. I've been writing hugely in the background. I'm also a fan of Simon Sinek. I love his podcast. The Why is really good. The Golden Circle is really good as well.
Yeah.
Chance. So yeah, it's really good, isn't it? I've been a fan of Simon Sinek for years now. we've got a few minutes for questions. I'm just having a quick look. I've just some comments really, Mike, really thought-provoking. Thank you so much. They love the analogy, so that's really great. And we've also had a share in the chat box. Oh, got lots. They're all coming in now. I'm trying to keep up with it. There's an article that might be of interest to people called by Robin McMahon, which is That Old Chestnut, Not That Old Chestnut, which we'll share with people on the brief. A superb presentation, lots of really great feedback. I guess for me, I'll open up with the first question, Mike, is you were really brave to show your vulnerabilities right at the beginning of the session about how you'd had a breakdown. And I'm a real fan of Brené Brown's work about showing your vulnerabilities. And I think that's a real, true, authentic leadership. I guess from my perspective, what because a lot of us have troubles, and we I think 1 in 4 people struggle with mental health. What would your advice be to kind of fellow nursing colleagues that are struggling at this time, being that you've been through kind of that through a breakdown and come back through and are still nursing and still in the profession?
So there's a really interesting picture that I saw on Twitter recently, and I can throw into the slide deck next to the questions if needs be, is that your best on any one day is never the same.
Yeah.
All right. If you're having a really good day and you're absolutely on fire, you're not going to sustain that, nor should you try to, because you're a human being and you are normal. All right. But equally as leaders, we need to acknowledge that our team's best will change over the course of a day. It will change potentially hour by hour. Because if we consider, and so when I do this as a full day presentation, I actually spin Maslow back on ourselves as nurses. Because I would argue that nursing is a form of actualization. We are undertaking an output that is of no benefit to ourselves, that is done solely for the benefit of others. And therefore, if we're not considering the other 4 stages in the hierarchy and applying them to ourselves, how do we nurse? But equally, our ability to actualize will change based on what's happening within those 4 areas. For example, and if I take my wife and I, we obviously we live in a state of matrimonial harmony. We never argue and we never have a disagreement. Of course we don't. Well, of course we do. We're human beings. It's what we do. But actually, if we walk out of the door that morning and we've left on slightly terse words because we're human beings, well, it's reasonable and normal to take 5 minutes when you first get into the office, have a cup of coffee, and just stop. Sometimes the most selfless thing we can do is to be selfish.
I really like that.
Okay.
We're not very good at that as nurses, though, are we?
We're not. And equally, through our imposter syndrome, sometimes we just need to lower the bar and acknowledge that our best today may not be the same as tomorrow, but that is still our best, and we are still good enough.
That's great, Mike. That is great. That was something I learned through RADA, actually, good enough. So I'm a fellow scholar. So no, it's really helpful, really helpful. I think Pippa might have a question. She's popped a camera on. I'm assuming that's Pippa. Is that right? Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Mike, for a really wonderful presentation. And I just really, I work every day as a coach, and imposter syndrome is it's written across everybody, whatever senior position they're in. If they're a nurse, doctor, manager, engineer, whatever, all of us carry imposter syndrome in our heads. And the assumptions that we make are these self-limiting beliefs that actually affect our behavior and shape our behavior is so powerful. And I spend a lot of my time just sort of unwrapping some of the assumptions that people may have that stop them behaving in particular ways. Because nursing attracts a lot of people ascribed to nurses in terms of the deferent position, a whole lot of inability, and actually to fight through some of those assumptions and reassert yourself, I think can be really difficult. But thank you for your talk, really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Pippa. Yeah, I think we've all taken a lot from it today. We've got a question in the chat box from Katie Hobbs. So Katie again reiterates great presentation, and she can completely relate to your first years of a junior officership She's an ITU nurse and responsible for a team of military ITU nurses. How can I help nurses new to ITU to develop a new professional identity? That's from Katie.
Okay, so Katie, so first one, and feel free to put in the chat, what unit are you at, please, Katie?
JHG North.
Okay, perfect. So I know JHG North very well, and I'm happy to have that conversation offline. So there's some things that you can do and something that I can do, because the KPI for my role within the military is to take research, policy, and clinical innovation and codify that to business as usual. It's essentially what you've described. And so how can you help nurses new to ITU to develop a new professional identity? Give them time, listen, have that conversation and walk alongside them. But equally, and as a HOD within ITU, you're in a hugely privileged position where you have the potential to shield them from that negative discourse. Something that we can talk about offline if you want, Katie, and please email me on DII, is that, so I'm actually going down to JHG South in January to do a full day with them on identity formation with their nurses. I'm more than happy, because it sits within my remit, within my work and in my day job, to jump in a car and come up to Northallerton and do a day with yourselves if you wanted to do that as part of your Thursday training.
What an offer. Thank you, Mike.
So, but what can you do at the moment? Firstly, display the best version of an ITU nurse that you can. So through social learning theory, they will mirror what you do. They will mirror, if you're subservient to anybody, rightly or wrongly, they will mirror that, because they will learn to understand consequence from your actions as a HOD. Okay, but equally mindful of the fact that many of those coming through, as I said earlier, are younger, and therefore what they want is authenticity. There's a piece, so Field Marshal Slim, and I don't quite like his quote, I changed it slightly now, but Field Marshal Slim, when he was presenting to West Point in the 1950s, said to know your men. I personally prefer know your people. And so get to know them, take them out and go and do something non-nursing for a day and have a team day. So there's that side to it. And there's also a piece of, and so Katie, you will have got to where you've got to on the basis of being as good as you are, and you will be very good by being where you are. Acknowledge that, recognize that, and have the confidence and belief in yourself to know that. And therefore leadership, again to quote Slim, leadership is just about being plain you. And actually, where we look at authenticity, if you lead as being plain you, as you lead as being who you are, then automatically you become authentic in your leadership style. And that can really support your team as you move them forward. So there's a couple of nuggets there, hopefully. But yeah, by all means, email me offline, and I'm more than happy to have a drive up to Northallerton at some point for one of your team days, and I'll come and deliver if needs be.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Katie, for your question. I think Jane's just joined us. I think that might be time for our last question, unfortunately, but we can obviously field more questions to Mike outside of the time frame. So Jane, over to you. Lovely to see you.
Yeah, great to see you too, Lucy. Thanks so much. Mike, absolutely excellent presentation. Really fantastic, extremely powerful. For me, how do we, what are the next steps for your research, and how do we embed this in nurse education at the very beginning? So we are empowering our student nurses, as well as sharing this with existing nurses so that they can be the excellent mentors of the future.
So that is a great question. Okay, firstly, so where does my research go? So I'm looking to widen it out. So there's two routes you can go down, and building on something that Katie was saying, is that sometimes with army nurses or military nurses, they align more closely to the military piece than the civilian piece. And that's why we end up with military nurses in positions where maybe they're not quite in a position to provide healthcare. Conversely, they align more closely with the nursing piece than the military piece. And when we take them out to a more austere environment, sometimes they can struggle. So there's a research gap there, but there's not huge amounts of literature on that, which makes from doctoral study very difficult. equally, there's an argument where I've looked at this from an A&E perspective because I'm an A&E nurse. I can empathise. And to come back to the point that Pippa was making, sorry, just very quickly, I think some of the reason that nurses arguably have a higher incidence of imposter syndrome than other areas is because we go into nursing because we're naturally empathetic. We naturally have ability to have the emotional intelligence to do what we do. And the emotional intelligence piece actually ties into what you're asking as well. And so as a result, because we have that emotional intelligence, sometimes if it goes too far, sometimes I wonder if that's where some of the imposter syndrome comes from. So where does this go now? So the first thing we need to do is, and this is what I'm trying to do, this is what, and again, I'll always shout out to Alison Leary because I just think she's an absolute hero. And Paul Crampton, who's up in Hull, and some of the work that he's doing at the moment. We're starting the discourse, we're starting the conversation. This conversation needs to be shouted from the tops of the mountains on full volume about how we do what we do as nurses. It's got to be a holistic piece. And I suspect that there is a role for, and this is just the world according to me now, I don't actually know how I'd make this happen, but within nurse education, we probably need to put something in their objectives for their first year, second year and third year about a session on identity. Okay. And if we could get something like that into the education standards for student nurses, where as nurse lecturers, and my next job, I'm going to be a principal lecturer with the military over at BCU. That's my next job starting in July. So if we can get something like that into the nurse training syllabus, that is where we will start to change things. This isn't going to happen quickly though. Let's be realistic. Okay. Florence wrote her notes on nursing in 1880, something like that, I think it was. Please don't quote me on that because I'm not completely confident over those numbers. But actually, there's a lot of what she says today that we can learn from. But things within an organization that employs 1.4 million people change slowly. Okay, but we need to start the discourse. We need to get people talking about it. And I suspect we need to get something into the education standards for student nurses where they actually learn about professional identity. Because once they understand what's happening through the stages, then they know what's going on. Is it right that as a second year student, we expect student nurses in their second year to have a blip and struggle for a while? All right, as they move into a state from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence through to unconscious competence. That happens in that kind of first part of the second year. But actually, if we don't tell them that's going to happen and that's normal, is there any reason they struggle? If we don't tell their mentors that that is going to happen, is there any reason that the mentors can't support them? And mentorship, and that's the other side to this, and I talk about the holistic sense. So we need to put something needs to come into student nurse education, absolutely. There also needs to be something within mentorship development and mentorship training that talks about this and the impact that mentors can have on this, because mentorship is key to professional identity formation. I'm more than happy to continue the conversation offline though.
Thanks, Mike. Oh, fantastic, and it created a lot of buzz around your presentation, definitely. We'll share Mike's contact details if you wanted to connect with him outside of the webinar. I think it'd be really helpful for a lot of people, so thanks, Mike. I'm sorry that we've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much, Mike. It's been a pleasure to host with you, and we'll look out for details of Mike's amazing feat riding from the jog, riding the jogs, the Land's End to John O'Groats in April. We'll keep you posted. Thank you so much for joining us all this morning, and look out for other webinars that are coming soon. We'll be going to once a week. Thank you all. Great to have you this morning.